So good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to Finders Keepers Property Intelligence 2024. It's lovely to be back here at Keble College. 6 years since we were last here, and a fab venue, as I'm sure you'll all agree. Keble College is one of Oxford University's largest colleges, apparently with a great hall that's even bigger than Christchurch. And Keble was formed back in 1870, so many thanks to the college for allowing us to use their facilities again this evening. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Paul Rushworth. I'm the Managing Director at Finders Keepers. I've been with Finders Keepers, FK, for 34 years. So, wow, thank you. So, much change in the industry over those years. There's been a number of different prime ministers, 9. There's been huge fluctuations in the economy. There's been huge fluctuations in interest rates. And there's been a massive raft, a significant increase in legislation over the years within the industry. So over the years, I've also met many very successful landlords and learnt just how robust the Oxfordshire market has proved to be. And I'm incredibly proud to live and work in such a special county. And Finders Keepers, we run a whole programme of varied client events across the year. We've done so for as long as I can remember. And so far this year, we've done all sorts of things. We've done the Aston Martin Museum. We've taken lots of clients to the Playhouse to see the Kite Runner. We've done historic walking tours in Woodstock. We've done a vineyard in Horsepath, who'd know? Who knew? For a tour and wine tasting. And we've done a guided tour of Waterperry Gardens. And we're about to do the Cold War tour of former RAF Upper Hayford Base next month. So anyway, this evening, this is our main annual seminar event, and it's an opportunity to update all of you on Oxfordshire's residential letting and sales market and some of the likely changes that could affect us going forward to help you all make informed decisions about your investment properties. So our speakers this evening, so we've got Rich Massingham, he's Head of Sales and Associate Director at Finders Keepers, and he's going to provide an update on the letting and sales market in Oxfordshire. We've got James Keble, Keble not spelt like the college, but with an A. And James is going to talk about an overview of investment financing in the buy-to-let market. James is from Capital Private Finance. We've also got David Butler, David, Head of Planning and Regulatory Services at Oxford City Council. And David's going to present on the Oxford Local Plan, as well as recent changes in national policy. And we've also got our other speaker, which is Timothy Douglas, Head of Policy and Campaigns at Propertymark, is that right? Yes. Right title, yep, good. And Timothy's going to update us on the PRS and how they're engaging, how Propertymark is engaging with the new government around, mainly around the Renters' Rights Bill. So many thanks to all of the speakers in advance. So thank you again for coming along. Let's get cracking. So a warm welcome to our first speaker this evening, Richard Massingham. Rich, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul. Very good evening, everyone. As mentioned, I'm here to provide an update on the local property market, both sales and lettings, within the next 10 minutes approximately, which is a little tight, but I will do my best. The reason why I'm slightly reluctant to commit to being so punctual with my timings is because a lot has happened in the property market over the last few years, and certainly since we met at last year's Property Intelligence. The property market continues to provide interest and intrigue as it weathers the latest external factors which have an impact on it, which, as I'm sure you all know, is absolutely everything. We're going to major on lettings, and we're going to start there too. I'm sure most of us within the room have become used to hearing about spiralling rents and the supply and demand imbalance within Oxfordshire over the last few years. Whilst we have certainly seen our fair share of increased rents, the devil is in the detail, and we pride ourselves on being ahead of any curve. I could talk endlessly and boringly about the strength of the property market in Oxford, why it will continue to flourish in the future, and why rents have increased so regularly. But the rent increases we have all heard so much about are beginning to soften ever so slightly. Now, I have to stress that they are softening from an incredibly high starting point. So it's worth making that point, but they are still softening nonetheless. But good growth when looked at year on year. We really wanted to focus on the rent levels tonight, as they have been the largest talking point from a regional and national perspective over the last few years, and now, with a new government in place, will continue to be so for the foreseeable future. When looking at year-on-year percentage increase rents throughout Oxfordshire since January 2016, it paints a really interesting picture. And the reason we've gone back this far is so we can provide a wide context. You can see that Oxfordshire has often tracked well against the general South East region and England. I do not know what happened in the year April 18 to April 19, though, so we'll just have to have that down as some sort of anomaly, I think. But what can also be seen in the data is that we've enjoyed more or less consistent growth of above 4% since March 2022, peaking in December in 2023 with annual year-on-year growth of 7.24%. As of July 2024, this growth has contracted slightly and is sitting at 6.5%, which, as I just mentioned, remains a very strong growth percentage, all things considered. Now, remember, this data is showing the annual rent increases for the whole of Oxfordshire, so we thought it would be useful to look at this in more detail. Oxfordshire is a large and diverse county with plenty of different areas and subsequent properties, tenants and demands. The latest top-performing regions for year-on-year rental growth were West Oxford, sitting at 8.25%, and the Vale of White Horse region at 8.1%. We've also included last year's percentage increase in brackets too, providing a view over a slightly longer period and therefore delivering a little more context when looking at the data. In recent years, we've noticed a huge increase of rents achievable within the family homes market. The pandemic saw a quick and dramatic shift in tenant requirements. Outside areas and space to work from home became the single most important thing. Since then, flexible working and the subsequent inclination to work from home more regularly maintained this high level of demand for 3 or more bedroom properties. In 2021, the Hong Kong residency route introduced by the previous government further cemented and increased the demand for these type of properties, as did the stamp duty holiday, which saw some homeowners moving into rental accommodation to ensure their sale would complete before this holiday ended. As a result, these larger properties were letting quickly, often off-market, at really good rent increases, and crucially, tenants were renewing for reasonable increases too, which further constricted the supply. In 2024, however, the demand for family homes has softened slightly, and we are finding it is now more the 1- and 2-bed properties that are in much higher demand, letting quickly and achieving those strong rent increases. This is completely throughout the county, and it's 100% consistent in the data. One of the things we found fascinating when looking at detail at this data is just how well the properties let and managed by FK performed when compared against this wider data set. We were incredibly proud, actually, to discover that the average rent achieved for the FK letting portfolio was way in excess of the general average for the county. The general data shows Oxfordshire's average, perhaps surprisingly, has more or less complete parity with the average rent for England. However, the average rent achieved for the properties under the stewardship of FK is an astonishing 15.7% higher than those figures at £1,525 per calendar month. Now, as much as I'd like to, I'm not going to stand here and crow, and I'm not going to preach too much about how the property's in the best condition, attract the best tenants, and achieve the highest rents. You probably already know this. You're conscientious landlords, I'm sure, one of many reasons why you're here this evening. I will just state, though, that across all of the offices, we have noticed that applicants are no longer just taking any old property. If they're going to pay these higher rents, they're going to expect good value, and actually a higher level of service from the property agent too. Properties in poorer condition, with dated bathrooms and kitchens, for example, are now taking longer to let and often need rent adjustments to secure a tenant. James Keble will shortly touch on funding options for improving properties, particularly making them more energy efficient, which is incredibly relevant now due to the UK government's proposed new minimum energy efficiency standards target. And of course, as Paul mentioned, our renovation teams will also be here in the Arco room across the quad, should you wish to chat to them about investing or renovating in your property. So moving on from rent, we've also been talking a lot about the imbalance between supply and demand over the last few years, and rightly so. It's been utterly tangible and something that we've been dealing with every single day. However, after 4 years of increase in demand, this year represents a slight change in the narrative. Demand is actually down 14.3% when compared against last year. However, it's important to remember that demand was at historically high levels last year. The reality is if you look at this demand versus the pre-pandemic years, it's up 62% versus 2017, 78% versus 2018, and 52% when compared to 2019. The demand drivers show little signs of moderating significantly in the short to medium term. We expect rental demand throughout Oxfordshire to remain healthy. I've presented on the drivers of this rental demand many times in the past and cannot go into them in any detail tonight. But it's great we have David Butler from the Oxford City Council with us to update us on the local plan. It will be very interesting to see how this feeds into Oxfordshire maintaining its position in coming years. Supply has mercifully increased year on year, but from a very low point, and according to the main property portals, remains 1/3 lower than those pre-pandemic levels. However, the softening of rents I mentioned earlier is being driven more by the slight changes in demand than by any increase in supply. Timothy Douglas from Propertymark will be presenting later on about how government policy will impact the lettings market. So all I will say here is we hope the government understands how imperative it is to boost the homes available for rent. It's an interesting time for the private rental sector, and it will continue to be. Of that, there is no doubt. Whatever is on the horizon, you can be sure that we will be on top of the detail and communicate effectively to you all when the time is right. The fact is, there is always something for landlords. We have faced numerous challenges over the last 10 years. Brexit, new build and government incentives, financial changes by the numerous chancellors, tenant fee ban, the pandemic. I could go on and on, but it continues to be a strong market, no matter what you're hearing or reading about in the national or even London-based media. So be mindful of the emotive language and headlines that are used. Yes, there are factors that will impact the market. Timothy will touch on some of those shortly. But really nothing stands out to us as a major concern. Rental demand will continue to grow, rents will continue to increase, and the transient nature of Oxford, combined with the desires of our landlords, will continue to be good bedfellows. Now, just a couple of minutes on the sales market, but myself, Daniel Knight, Katie Clark, Henry Mullinger, we'll all be around after the presentations this evening should you wish to talk to us in any detail about the market or your property specifically. But the fact is, when I was asked to present on the state of the sales market at last year's Property Intelligence, I think it's fair to say I was a little reluctant. In fact, looking back at my notes, I think the 7th word I used in my presentation was tumultuous. And looking back, I completely stand by that word. It had been a monumentally difficult 12 months after the Liz Truss premiership. We had less stock, we had less people looking, even fewer people were offering on properties, and even the properties that we had sold and were in our pipeline, they were regularly being renegotiated as prospective buyers had been completely spooked by what had happened and they thought they'd overpaid. However, if you fast forward another 12 months, the story is rather different again. The microclimate of Oxfordshire has resulted in an almost coming out of the other side feeling, and really quickly, and by almost every metric you look, the market is on an upwards trajectory again. There is more stock on the market, there is more activity, there's more offers, there's more sales. Yes, the market is still price sensitive, and if you overprice a property, you're going to find out pretty quickly. But there is real momentum in the market, and we see no reason why this will not continue into the autumn, into 2025. Underlining that confidence is the rather quick change downwards in mortgage rates. At the start of August, the base rate was cut for the first time in more than 4 years, bringing it down to 5% after being held at 5.25% since August 2023. This follows inflation falling to Bank of England's 2% target for the first time since May 2021. And interestingly, markets are now pricing in around a 45% chance of another 25 basis point cut at the next Bank of England meeting, which is just over 2 weeks' time. As a result of all of this, the average mortgage rate continues to creep down from the highs of last year. There's also a larger range of mortgage deals available this year after 10% of the market were withdrawn by lenders throughout 2023. In fact, there are currently nearly 7,000 options, which is the highest level since February 2028. And to showcase this regained confidence in the sales market, and James might have some slightly different stats to the ones I've got, but I wanted to highlight the average house price growth throughout the region over the last year. As you can see, West Oxford aside, those are some pretty impressive growth figures, and all of this means that the average house price in Oxfordshire is now already higher than their previous peak back in October 2022, and that seems to me to be a strong foundation for them to continue to grow in the future. Thank you.
So I'm going to hand over straight away now to James Keble. Thank you. Thank you.
So, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming today. My name's James Keble, and I'm Financial Services Director of Capital Private Finance. And we are the finance partners of Finders Keepers, but also of other premium brand estate agency businesses, which you might have heard of, Hamptons International, for example, also John D. Wood, and we exclusively look after all of their financial needs. So something you may not know, however, though, is that we're all part of a bigger group of companies called Connells Group. And Connells Group is actually the largest property services group in the UK. Now, we don't shout about that all of the time, but actually it gives us some real good financial strength and advantages. Maybe let's go backwards and forwards. Strengths and advantages, because actually, 10% of all the properties sold in the UK were through the Connells Group. Up to 13% of all properties let in the UK were through the Connells Group. And actually, my area, 10% of all mortgages written in the UK were through the Connells Group. We didn't handle all of those, unfortunately for me, but we did our fair chunk, and certainly at the medium to higher value property area, that's our niche, if you like. So if anyone wants to grab me or my colleague Dan afterwards and wants some any more specific financial advice, then I'll be more than happy to have a chat with you. But today what I'm going to do is draw upon and take advantage of some of that Connells data to give you some macro views of what's going on, but also drill down into some more micro information as well for the Oxfordshire area. But as Richard said, some of our detail might be slightly different, but there are reasons for that. But statisticians will probably be able to give you the pointers as to why they are. But hopefully you'll get a picture of what we're trying to look at here, because I think if you look at the press, if you look or if you speak to politicians, then landlords aren't necessarily the most popular people in the world, and I'm sure you've felt that occasionally. And I don't think that's particularly fair. I'm sure you don't think that's particularly fair, because you provide an essential service. What we need to do is make sure that you have the right information to be able to make the right decisions about your portfolios, about your properties, and about whether the time is right to actually go in further or to come out. And I think there's Richard has sort of alluded to some of the challenges we've had. We've had a cost of living crisis, we've had interest rates, we've had all of these things, and we've got a budget coming up with our new government where people are sort of talking about potential capital gains tax changes. Well, look, if you were actually thinking about selling a property this year anyway, then you would probably be sensible to consider selling it before the budget happens. However, if you weren't looking at doing that, well, I'm going to give you quite a lot of reasons why actually that's probably not the best thing to do, because the one thing that the government has said is that they're looking to make some unpopular decisions in the short term. So you might find that some changes that might happen, if they do happen, won't necessarily be there forever, and therefore if you're looking at property investment for the medium and long term, then absolutely it's the right thing to do. History tells us that, but also the future is going to probably reiterate that as well. So let me have a look at some of the numbers. So what we've got here is some Connells national data, first of all. And the view we have is that there is no mass signs of exodus from the rental market. You know, you might hear those headlines or see those headlines on the newspapers, but actually the data doesn't back that up. And in fact, if you look at what we've seen, 77% of properties that were up for renewal have been relet in Q2. So, and actually, even more than that, only 18% of properties have actually been sold, or the smaller term landlords moving into the property. So there is no mass exodus, and those figures have been backed up from what we've seen since H1 of this year as well. So that isn't what we're seeing. Also, rent reviews. Now, backing up what Richard was talking about, rent reviews are happening. 73% of properties that were up for renewal had a rent review, and guess what? Those rents weren't going down. So, you know that there's lots of challenges, don't get me wrong. Mortgage costs have gone up, and some of the other costs associated with being a landlord have gone up as well. But actually, it's coming back to us again, and I'll talk to you about that in a moment. But you'll see that 86% of June renewals were for new fixed terms. Now, short-term lets are talked about often, that isn't a massive part of the marketplace, though, and it still continues to be longer-term, fixed-term rental agreements are what is taking up the vast proportion of what we're seeing in the marketplace right now. And landlords, you'll know this. If you get a good tenant, you want to hang on to that good tenant. And if you are a tenant, you don't want to be having to look for another property either. So longer-term rental agreements are, the picture. 31 months is the average that we're seeing out there at the moment. So again, just all going to show that the picture is a little bit more rosy than the press might have you believe. We see that the market remains strong. But let's look at that in a bit more of a micro position. But that chart, lots of numbers on. There's 15 years of property values on there because, as landlords, yes, you've got a business which gives you a monthly income, but you've also got an asset. And that asset has been going up in value religiously. And in fact, that's the Oxfordshire area. You've got overall figures there. What might surprise you is there's only 1 year in the last 15 where property prices haven't gone up. And guess what? It wasn't last year. With all the challenges that we had last year, cost of living, interest rates, energy prices, you name it, it was actually 2009, would you believe? So but every other year in Oxfordshire, property has gone up. There's one anomaly to that, one area, one class of property where that isn't the case. Anyone know what that is? Flats. It is flats. And there might be more than one reason, but the major reason that we see for that happening is that, it's a bit of a fallout from the pandemic, really. There has been a move out of conurbations, but we're seeing that reverse this year. So actually, and if you look, which we will in a second, at the rental market, you will actually see that flats are fighting back. So if we look at rental information over there on the right-hand side, you can see that that's the increase in rents for the last year, and we can see over with flats, it's 9.6% as opposed to the average, which is 7.5%. So actually, that is the sort of forerunner, if you like, that flats and the popularity of flats is coming back. So you probably know that already, but you can see massive returns. And just back over here, if you look at the property value perspective, 1% overall increase in the value of property in Oxfordshire in the last year, but 44% over the last 10 years. Imagine if you'd put that money in a bank account. What return would you have got during that 10 years with interest rates for the majority of that being 0.25%? I think I know where I'd have my money. So, we don't see that changing, and there's a slide I'm going to show you right at the end of the presentation, which I wanted you to take particular notice of because it might encourage you that now's the time to actually increase your proposition rather than decrease it. So, let's talk a little bit about mortgages. Mortgage costs are coming in significantly lower now. Does anyone know the interest rate that TMW is the mortgage arm of Nationwide, they released a new rate last week, 3.49% for buy-to-let. Okay? So a few people are making, well, I like the sound of that. If you think about where we were only 3 or 4 months ago, and certainly for most of last year, you were talking 5 or 6%. And stress tests that went alongside that were even worse. So it meant that, even if you could afford the mortgage, you actually probably didn't qualify for it because the rents weren't enough to actually remortgage. So it was murder. That's changing. Please grab Dan afterwards and we'll talk to you about your individual situations and how we might be able to make it more manageable. But also, not only are the products cheaper, but we're getting some innovation in the marketplace as well. We talked about, and Richard talked about the rental market and energy efficiency. One of the key things and messages that we need to give you, that if you improve the property value, if you improve the quality, if you improve the energy efficiency, it's going to improve your yield, improve your value. And one site that I'm going to direct you towards is Birmingham Midshires. Birmingham Midshires are the buy-to-let arm of Lloyds Banking Group. And if you look on their website, there's a retrofit tool on there which gives you information about all the ways that you can make your portfolio more energy efficient. But not only that, it gives you all of the ways that you can gain government grants, both nationally and locally, in order to be able to get somebody else to pay for it. So look, I would suggest that is a really good place for you to start your inquiries. And if you want to raise some money in order to be able to make those, you might have to pay for some of it. And if you want to raise some money to be able to do that, then remortgaging is a lot easier to do. And one of the ways in which you might be able to do it right now is Aldermore have brought out a really interesting product which looks at the value and performance of your entire portfolio in one mortgage rather than having many mortgages. And there's lots of advantages of doing that, as you've probably already worked out. One, they don't charge you for surveys. So let's say you can have up to 30 properties all in one mortgage, one arrangement fee, which is no bigger than a normal arrangement fee, free surveys, and you take advantage of the power and strength of your entire portfolio. So if you had a couple of sort of weaker properties in your portfolio that may be higher loan to values, maybe they weren't calculating well on the stress tests, well, that doesn't really matter as long as the whole portfolio adds up. So no more having to fill in a spreadsheet every time you do a remortgage. That sounds good, doesn't it? And just one application. Takes a little bit of time to get it set up, but once you do, then it's moving it in and out is really quite easy. So again, that's a way of saving an awful lot of money and actually making your lives a lot easier and taking advantage of the full power of your portfolio. So, okay, so property values, as we know, are increasing. Yields are increasing. Connell's Group have registered 11% more investors in the first half of this year than we did last year. So, and that's increased again, even after the Labour government's come in, and so we see that continuing. Now is the perfect time to enhance and expand your portfolio. And I'm going to give you a little visualization of that to leave you with. I love this graph. Now, there's a lady by the name of Anisha Beveridge, who you may have heard of. She is Hampton's head of research. She's the person that they call upon on BBC News nowadays to give information, and Bloomberg and various others. She put this together for me. And this basically, I know this is London, but it says London house prices as a proportion of the national average. But as you will probably know, London is the epicenter normally of the property market. It starts there and it sort of ripples out. So this graph applies just the same for Oxfordshire as anywhere else. But you can see there, it's a lovely sort of replication, if you like, of how the property market is cyclical. Now, we sort of know that. But the interesting bit is that it goes all the way back to 1968, and you can see the rise and falls, the rise and falls, and the rise and falls. And the most recent one has been quite a long 11-year wait for it to turn again. But we're just seeing, although it's not on that figure because it only goes up to May, that little line at the end there has just turned up again. which obviously is very important because that means that we're just about to go up and continue, we believe, to go up for a considerable long time. So now is, in my view, is the absolute sweet spot for investing in property again, because that property value is going to go up. The interest rate costs, they're not the 1 or 2% we had before, but then again, that's unlikely to be back again. But they're not bad. 3.5% costs right now with property prices going up now could be exactly the right time to expand your portfolio. All right, I'm going to leave you there. Thank you very much.
Right, I'll hand quickly on to David.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Dave Butler. So I'm Head of Planning and Regulatory Services at Oxford City Council. Whole presentation with no graphs and no data tables, I'm afraid. So you'll have to make do with some pretty pictures. So I was asked to talk a little bit about our local plan. So we have a new local plan that's currently in examination in public. So that means it's sort of an independent inspection by government at the moment. And it runs to 2040. So I thought I'd give a little bit of context, some of the things that are in there. And obviously, it does speak a little bit to where we're talking, you know, what's happening right now on the ground in terms of that demand for housing and how we think that that isn't going to go away anytime soon. So what is Oxford? I suppose from our point of view, we've got to look at the benefits of Oxford, what kind of city it is, but also what are its issues. So we have an incredibly important economic output as a city, both sort of nationally and internationally. We are one of very few contributors to national GDP. So we have a really good line into government when there's a problem in Oxford. People do listen. And that's really predicated on the wonderful universities we have, both Brookes and the Oxford University, and the R&D and the life science spin-outs that are coming out of that. It's a huge ecosystem that is delivering huge amounts of employment growth. Anybody travelling in from the north will see Oxford North coming out of the ground. Obviously, we've got ARC, we've got the Science Park, but we've got individual sort of changes, much more dense employment line coming forward in Botley Road. There is no shortage of jobs. In fact, we have more jobs than we have people within the city. So we have inward commuting, and that's all really, really positive. And that is what's feeding a lot of the growth in house price costs that we see. But there are some downsides to that. It doesn't take a lot to pick away to find that actually that is only benefiting part of the city. There's a huge economic disparity within the city, and it's quite a startling statistic when we read it, that depending on where you live in the city can affect your lifespan by over 15 years. So the local plan looks to really reinforce and encourage and facilitate that economic growth. But we're also really concerned about how we deliver good homes for people outside of the private rented sector, very much in our affordable homes sphere. So that's what the local plan tries to do, tries to balance off all of those things in one single, quite long document. But first of all, we've got to decide what our housing need is. Those of you who've been keeping an eye on the press, the kind of mandated targets are back. But in our local plan, we exceed those quite significantly. We think, based on the economic growth model that the city has and that we know is coming, that we're looking around about 1,300 dwellings a year that we need within the city. So that's quite a lot of new homes. Those of you who are familiar with Oxford, which I assume is the entire room, will know that it's a very constrained city as well. It's surrounded by greenbelt. We've got large amounts of floodplain where obviously you can't put housing. We have a wonderful sort of series of spires, incredibly historic buildings, all of which it's very frowned upon to knock down and just put houses on. So we need to make sure that we're delivering as much capacity as we can for housing. So we've really literally overturned every stone. We've looked at every kind of green field that we can to deliver homes within the city. And we think we can get about 480. It's actually up to 500. The site's come forward recently. So around about 500 homes a year, we think we can deliver every year between now and 2040. So that's great. That's new homes coming into the city. Brilliant. But it's nowhere near enough to meet our need. So although we're encouraging as dense developments as possible, you know, kind of really looking at how high we can go, how we keep our national space standards, but we're really kind of delivering good homes with good green spaces opportunities. But it's not enough. So we talk to our neighbours. That's the fun part of planning, is trying to convince our neighbouring authorities to take that residual need, around about 800 homes per year. We're looking for our neighbours to take on board. That has mixed results, shall we say. Some neighbours are more happy than others. But in actual fact, we already have a local plan in place. as do all of our neighbours, and most of that need is already accommodated for. So we have large developments, land north of Bayswater Brook, which is in South Oxfordshire. We've got Begbrook coming out in Charwell, and these are delivering thousands of homes that are there to meet Oxford's needs. They're well connected. There's public transport, mass transit opportunities, so people can commute in, and that will help deliver some of our need. But that just delivers our need now, and we really got to recognise that our employment growth, that's going to keep on coming in ways that we don't expect currently. And that ecosystem will keep going, and it will keep driving need. We're really concerned about environmental standards. That's a big, important part for us. And so we are seeking in the new plan to make all homes net zero in construction and net zero in operation, which is a big cost to developers, which we recognise. But we think it's really, really important, both in terms of keeping people's bills down, but also energy resilience and obviously decarbonisation and improving people's lives and lifespans. That's meant that we've reduced the amount of affordable housing that we require in the local plan. So at the moment, if you bring forward a site for 100 dwellings, 50 of those need to be affordable housing. The vast majority needs to be social rent. That's going to reduce to 40% in the next plan, so that's a big chunk that allows development to come forward in the way and the shape that we want it, because we know it costs lots. But there are some significant issues which we can't really beat about the bush. So that unmet need is a huge issue. How do we make sure that our neighbours who are more reluctant to deliver housing in some cases, how do we make sure that it comes forward? How do we make sure it comes forward in the quality and the space that we want it to? We have what's called a duty to cooperate, so we have some legal mechanisms to do that, but really how that works in the future and the way the government is going with regional planning will be very interesting, and hopefully we'll begin to look at Oxfordshire as a system rather than as a series of districts, which is how the planning system sets it up. Infrastructure is a real big problem. That's going to be a big problem nationally, where we're looking at, the government's looking at 1.5 million homes over the next 5 years, 300,000 a year. Is the infrastructure in place? Not just highways infrastructure, but particularly for us right now, water. You know, we've huge issues with Thames Water. That's no surprise, that's in the public domain. We have insufficient sewage capacity for our projected growth. That needs to happen, and that needs to happen really quickly for it to come online. So although we can allocate land for homes up till 2040, we're not in control of the really vital infrastructure that needs to come forward to make that happen. So we're working really hard. As I said earlier, we have lines into government. So, we're sitting down with Director Generals of the various different sort of government bodies. We're sitting down with the Chief Exec of Thames Water, really trying to hold their feet to the fire to deliver the improvements that we need to allow for the growth that we need without harming the environment further. And obviously the state of the rivers nationally is a significant concern. Once we've dealt with Thames Water, which hopefully will be soon, we're then on to power, because power is critical for us, particularly as we get more and more into requiring EV charging points, into air source and heat source pumps. How are we heating and decarbonising that network? That's really important for us as well. And again, plays back to why PV panels and sort of generating your own energy is really, really important. Finally, resource scarcity. It's an awful lot of homes. Are there enough bricklayers? Are there enough people to do all of these works for us? And that's really important as well. And as a council, are there enough planners? Are there enough legal officers? All of these things are real concerns, because it's bizarrely not the most glamorous of jobs. And we're finding a real drop-off in people qualifying in planning across the country, in even like planning schools are closing as well. And again, with all the best will in the world, we just need some bums on seats. So we have at least 4 apprentices at any one time working through our planning system and staying with us. But really that kind of capacity of the system to deliver across the board is a concern, but one that we're looking at and working on. So that's the local plan. I guess the other thing that I didn't put on my slides, but just reflecting on some of what we've heard recently, is traditionally it's been really hard to do retrofit within conservation areas. And obviously there's 1 or 2 of those in Oxford, as you can imagine. And so what we're working really hard on is, with our conservation team, is identifying and making it easy for people to understand what retrofit and what decarbonisation they can do within their conservation area. So we're starting with probably 2 of the most difficult ones, which is Osney Island and Jericho. So if you've got properties there, I'd be really interested to talk to you. But just generally in conservation areas, how we can deliver things like PV panels on front-facing roof slopes and those kinds of things, where we know we need to do these things to help everybody, but it's actually quite difficult, and the system is set up difficulty. So we're trying to do those things both within the local plan and outside of it as well. happy to chat at length for anybody who wants to talk about the MPPF consultations and other consultations that are coming, but there's sort of the three big things that I think may be of interest to you. Lots more homes, that's got to be good. It's not going to meet the demand that's out there. It feels pretty insatiable at the moment, but the standard method will increase the volume of homes within Oxfordshire if everybody follows it, and that's a big if. But at the moment, if you add up all of our local plans together, including our one that's in draft at the moment, we'll look about 4,800 homes a year. The new standard method makes it at least 5,200. So we're looking at increasing the volume of homes that are coming out of the ground in Oxfordshire, which gives everybody more opportunities, of course, in terms of purchasing, renting, etc. How are we going to deliver that? Well, government is very keen on Greenbelt. New communities is slightly separate in terms of the new towns, but that's a fascinating place as to where do you put those within the country. But Greenbelt release will be slightly easier. There's a new thing called Greybelt. We've had a look. It doesn't really affect us particularly, but that's kind of previously developed land in Greenbelts. You kind of think often like airfields or those kind of things where it's a peculiar place and it's now surrounded by greenfields. So that's of interest in terms of how you can maybe deliver those additional 100, 200, 300 homes a year that we're expecting. And then finally, fees. Fees are going up. Householder fees will go up from 258 to 528. Pretty sure they just rearranged the numbers to get that. But we're also looking at, there's a big consultation about whether we would localise fees. So at the moment, then fees are nationally set for all of your planning requirements. There's an opportunity to maybe localise those. So that would see where different councils are charging different amounts, which is going to be difficult. You know, cross-boundary, you know, you could be paying more in one place than another. But what it might do is address some of the resource issues that we have in terms of getting people's permissions through quicker. So what are our next steps? We need to adopt this local plan, get it over the line. So we're in the middle of an examination public. We hope to be back in that fairly soon. Get that adopted, maybe summer of next year. But then we need to look at what's next, regional planning. That's very much the government's agenda. They're looking at regional planning across sort of combined authority, mayoral type area scale at the moment. Obviously, that doesn't apply to us. Oxfordshire is the obvious line for us to draw. Can we get all the politicians, because it's a very political thing, can we get them all in a room to agree on a growth agenda and a growth trajectory? That will be an interesting place to go. But it is what we need to do, because if you think the way the city is growing, it's quite a number of large developments on the fringes of the city that actually sit in other people's districts. So you live in a house north of Bayswater Brook when that's built, you will feel part of Oxford City, you'll be paying your rates to South Oxfordshire. It's going to be quite a peculiar position. So we need to look a bit wider and understand how infrastructure and people move about our ecosystem. And then also we need to unblock that delivery. So, you know, Thames Water, we've got to help, we've got to get that over the line, because if we don't get the houses. If we don't sort out our transport infrastructure and look at how we move people around within a really constrained environment, new roads are not going to be the answer. How do we move people around outside of that? They're going to be the things that unblock our delivery. There we go. That was rattled through in 10 minutes, but I will happily talk to everybody later.
So on to our final speaker of the evening. So Timothy, it's...
Right. Hello. Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Paul, and the Finance Cubes team for inviting me here today. Fantastic venue, fantastic turnout. So I am Timothy Douglas. I'm the head of policy and campaigns. Sounds very grand, doesn't it? At Propertymark. And I'm just going to talk about Propertymark as an intro before we get into some of the bit of the detail that I think you want to know about. And I also nearly fell off my chair as well when Dave was talking about local plans, because my background is I worked for an MP in Westminster, former minister, I've worked for a member of the European Parliament in Brussels, and I spent 8 years as a borough councillor. And you can all work out from the end of my presentation whether I voted for the local plan or not. Yeah. Say no more. But let's move on. So essentially, it's my job at Propertymark to gather what we're hearing from the membership, from our member agents, pull that all together and fire that into governments across the UK. But it's also to kind of digest some of the legislative churn, what's happening, and put that into easily digestible formats for agents, which then ultimately means they can support you guys as landlords. So, importantly, Propertymark is a professional membership body. We've got 18,000 members across the UK. These are business owners down to employees. And I think the important bit is that We regulate members' activity. Outside of Scotland, where you need a level 6 qualification, sign up to a Scottish Government's register, a statutory code of practice, and a minimum day's training course in Wales, there's no statutory qualification or regulation of letting agents or sales agents. The legislation is UK-wide on the Estate Agency Act 1979. So you are in the best hands with finders keepers and Propertymark agents, because you are getting an additional level of qualification, training, and compliance, and they are plugged in to what is happening. So they are a step above from the other agents that are out there. And anyone can guess who's that chap in the photo? Yes, it's me on the left. Who's on the right? Well, that, friends, is Matthew Pennycook. Matthew Pennycook is a housing minister. He's second in command to Angela Rayner. And this is me chewing his ear off, quite literally, at the Labour Party conference last year, where we exhibited. And a big push from us, Propertymark's point of view, is we believe that all property agents should be qualified and regulated. He committed to that, and I've got the photo to prove it. And actually, he did put down amendments in the Leasehold and Reform Bill in the last Parliament, which didn't quite make it through, but he said Labour Party is committed to Lord Best's report, which is the precursor to regulation. So lobbying and conversations can work, they do turn into government activity, and we've already been haranguing his office on various things now that he's in post. So what do? I've just briefly touched on that. Guidance, information. We sit on lots of industry and government working groups. About 4.5 years went into the Renters Reform Bill, and it didn't even make it through, and we'll come on to talk about that in the end. We lobby ministers and politicians, and we produce research and position papers. Again, picture round. That's me on the right. Who's on the left? That's Rachel McLean, one of the 17 housing ministers we've had in the last 10 years. Exactly, I thought I'd get a cheer for that. That's me at Conservative Party conference last year, and that's me giving her our position paper on the impact of tax changes from Section 24, changes to the wear and tear allowance, stamp duty, and all the costs that you guys have incurred that has, to some extent, in certain parts of the country, stifled supply or confidence, but as we've alluded to previous speakers, is coming back and happening in different markets across the country. So that's a big part of what we do. But let's get a bit more into the detail. The UK government, of course, had a general election. Now, James, you referred to these pesky politicians. Now, what I would say is, out of the 365 MPs that we've got, 300 are newly elected. They haven't been an MP before. That's great, because it means I've got to go and talk to them all about Propertymark. But 85 MPs are landlords claiming 10 grand or more in income from their property. So when it comes to lobbying, when it comes to the crunch time to vote on this stuff, they do know, and they do have a conscience too. So we'll be targeting those MPs. And 45 of that 85 are Labour MPs as well. And I think if you've listened to the news recently, I would say the poor MP for Ilford South, it's not as easy as it looks, is it? And that is the point. And I think, of course, he said he used an agent, but he didn't use a Propertymark agent. And that's the point we've already made to Matthew Penny. I checked it. That's the point we've already made to Matthew Pennycook's office. But that's the point, the damp and the mould, the ants infestation, and he didn't even sign up to the licensing schemes that he passed as a councillor. God help us. So, conversations, talking, this is what we do. It is a continual journey. So it's not all anti-landlord, they hate us, we hate us. There is some understanding. And don't get me started on the House of Lords. Love the House of Lords. They are into the detail, and there's lots of people with vested interest in the Lords who understand and get property and land going forward. So they will certainly, as they did with the Renters Reform Bill, scrutinise that legislation all the way through. So this is what we've got so far from the UK government's agenda. Planning and Infrastructure Bill, we've already touched on that. I think there are some good stuff in there. Housing, the economy, they see the benefits of that. Look at what we achieved for our lobbying in the pandemic, the stamp duty holiday, the economic, I think people spend on average £10,000–12,000 when they move house, and the knock-on effect that has. But 1.5 million houses to build, as Dave has alluded to. I think agents and landlords are going to play a big part in that. Government officials have already said to us, well, we need decent agents, we need professional agents, we're going to need landlords to house people. So we are, the collective, going to play an important part of that. I think the warning sign is they've said they're going to need, or they've pledged 300 new planning officers to support local councils. How are they going to pay for that? Well, they're going to pay for that by raising the non-UK resident surcharge. So it's already 2% when you buy a property. They're looking to raise that. Rachel Reeves said that last year in her speech at the Labour Party conference, and it's come out in more of the rhetoric and the correspondence we've seen from the government. So that's just something to consider. Obviously, you'll pay your SDLT, you'll pay for 3%, you'll pay your 2% if you're a non-resident UK person, if you're buying property, but that is likely to go up to pay for those things. So that's just something to think about. But importantly, the UK government have said they will produce a housing strategy. I nearly fell over when I heard that. That was fantastic. We've not had that for a while. So there's the budget at the end of October. Spending reviews will happen in the spring, and it's highly likely that that housing strategy will happen then. But they've been quite canny. They're looking at the MPPF first. Why? Because it's easier to change policy and guidance than it is to go through the House with legislation. The draft leasehold and common hold reform bill, why are they doing it in draft? It means that they can do the debate kind of in private through a committee. If you think ground rent, the argument there got harangued, stalled in the last leasehold bill, so they'll have extra scrutiny on that. But that will change, potentially ban new build leasehold flats, reinvigorate common hold, which they've tried to do, and cap ground rents as well. So they've got to look at all the investment and pension funds that sit behind ground rents to please them in order to do that. The Digital Information Smart Data Bill, that sounds good, doesn't it? Well, basically what they're looking to do, and this is probably more for you, Paul, and the agents in the room, but what they're looking to do here is essentially, in home buying and selling space, allow the consumer to have their identity checked once, and then it's transferred seamlessly throughout the process. If you think about it now, when you buy a house, you have to give your ID to the agent, AML checks, you have to give your ID to the lender, then you've got to give your solicitor, and then da-da-da-da. So they're looking at how can they essentially passport your ID to speed up that transaction process and reduce the duplication in order to speed up home buying and selling. So we're sort of watching that and engaged with DSIT, Science, Innovation, Technology Department, on that front. And then we've got the Renters' Rights Bill, which I'm going to go through in a couple of slides in a bit more detail. But I think it's fair to say, we have to be honest with ourselves, that it's a manifesto commitment. There are all sides of the House, political colours, are agreed and signed up to banning Section 21, reforming the private rented sector. So change will come. It's just, what does that change look like and when's it going to happen? I'm hopefully going to give you some insight into what that's going to look like and maybe calm the waters on that timescale. A couple of other things for you guys that you're going to need to know about. Energy efficiency. When I talk to government, I say, forget the Renters' Rights Bill. Energy efficiency, minimum energy efficiency standards, is the ticking time bomb in the room. But I got a letter from Ed Miliband last week, his office. It was great. And I'll quote you what he said. The government is committed to reducing the number of fuel-poor households in England in line with the 2030 target. Ensure warmer, healthier, private rented homes will lift many families out of fuel poverty and reduce energy bills. We will therefore require landlords to make improvements to their properties by 2030, and we are considering how we can best support and encourage landlords to do this. So I think from that, we have to, again, acknowledge change is coming, energy efficiency, climate, 20% of emissions comes from UK buildings. It is a significant policy area for the government. 2030 they've set as the target, but we don't know what that's going to be. Is it going to be D? Is it going to be C? Is it going to carve out maybe some of the more hard-to-reach properties in conservation areas, listed buildings, targeting the fuel poor, how they define that? So we do know the date is 2030, but we haven't got that EPC banding yet, and there's always been talk about EPC reform as well. What does that look like? So just start to think about that. Have you taken advantage of all the quick wins? Have you scoured the council for any funding they can provide? What are your tenants in the property? Can you get money from the energy supplier as well? And there's various schemes from the UK government as well. So get stuck into all of them and get ahead of the game, you know, if major renovations are planned. I was just going to quickly touch on short-term lets were mentioned, a previous speaker. The Levelling Up Act has committed or passed into law, you know, a kind of register and database of short-term lets, so that will come. The current government have told us they don't quite know what they're going to do with it, but that potentially will come down the line. And also in the anti-money laundering space, again, sort of more for the agents in the room, I did see some very high rents. Did I see 13,000 per calendar month? Exactly. So for those of you who don't know, all estate agents must sign up with HMRC to be supervised for anti-money laundering regulation. If you're a letting agent dealing with rents with 10,000 euros or the equivalent amount or more, you've got to sign up with HMRC for AML supervision, do customer due diligence on all your clients, have a risk assessment, etc. Well, HMRC are looking to lower that threshold, so it would bring more of those properties into it, and they're also looking to bring in holiday let businesses as well, registered holiday let businesses in that. So there's lots of things happening we just need to be aware about. And there's some challenges and opportunities, as I always say. So the Renters' Rights Bill, of course everyone's heard of the Renters' Reform Bill. Yes, groans, yes. Well, it's not so different, really. It's a bit of rinse and repeat. And I picked out pretty much some of the headline things that we know from the King's speech, and some of the bit more conversations we've had with sort of government officials. So again, we talked, you know, abolishing Section 21 is a manifesto commitment from Labour, and then they want to beef up, continue the narrative that they're going to beef up Section 8 and some of the other grounds around antisocial behaviour, etc., going forward. Tenants' rights to request a pet. Well, when I talk about this one, I always say to the government, well, we're not going to give you anything on this because you ban deposits or you cap deposits. So that's the reason why the risk appetite for many landlords has reduced for banning pets. But essentially, the requests will come in. You can't unreasonably refuse. Unreasonably refuse won't be designed in this legislation. It will come through in guidance in secondary legislation. But essentially, you will be able to ensure that there's some pet insurance taking out on the property. It does seem as though you will be able to take that out yourselves and charge that back, so they'll have to amend the Tenant Fees Act. I can think of a scenario if they don't. The tenant takes out the pet insurance in month 1, cancels it in month 6, and then you need it at the end of the tenancy and it's not there. So the insurance products have got to be in place for it to work as well, and obviously bridge the difference should there be a default on that insurance. So there's lots of detail that needs to be worked out to make that a reality. A PRS database, which started as a portal in the Renters Reform Bill and then a database. Essentially here, it's a landlord register by the back door. We are the only country across the UK doesn't have a landlord register of some description, so you'll have to enter various property details, and then from that, standards, potentially gas certificates will form part of that. And ultimately, we are making the case that agents will need full access to that and an understanding of what's going on there. But the idea is that local authorities will have access to it and be able to use it for enforcement purposes. And hold that thought, because we're going to use that to our advantage in a moment. Ending discrimination, and this is obviously targeted at where the government see discrimination against people renting with children or on benefits. And I think we do not want to see discrimination in our sector at all and condemn it outright. However, I think in the welfare space, Again, it's a consequence of local housing allowance being frozen. You have to get the money in arrears, the 5-week wait for universal credit. The system just simply doesn't work for the private rented sector. So I think if we can iron out some of those issues, you will iron out further discrimination in the sector. But it essentially will be a ban on advertising. It won't stock any credit checks or anything like that going forward. And ultimately, people can't access homes in a lot of cases because they can't pass the finance checks and suitability as well. Strengthening local authority enforcement powers. I think, Dave, you'll probably get a few extra quid exactly to do some more inspections, but hopefully that will lead to inspection league tables and making local authorities, giving them the support but making them more accountable. The only thing I haven't put on there is the decent home standard, which will be extended to the private rented sector. That is obviously a standard that exists in the social rented sector. The conversations we've had, we've sat on lots and lots of working groups with the government on this, is that do not almost throw the bath, the baby out with the bathwater, in the sense of, in the social rented sector, you have very type of properties that are very similar. Private rented sector, you've got a myriad of properties, therefore it's harder to have a standardised standard. And don't remove age and functionality. You might have a very old kitchen, bathroom, but is it still safe? Is it still functional? And you've probably got more of that in the private rented sector as well. I nearly fell over when the local authority I was elected to represent changed the boilers in the properties that they managed every 5 years without fail. Yeah, exactly, and there we go. So if we had that funding in the private rented sector, then I think we'd be solving some of these issues. Certain things that may be new that weren't in the Renters Reform Bill, that have sort of been flagged up in the Renters' Rights Bill. Of course, we haven't seen the bill yet, but some of the narrative that's come out for government. A new ombudsman. I think this was in the Renters Reform Bill, so they're basically saying that all landlords, regardless of whether they use an agent, would need to sign up to a new ombudsman. There was then lots of confusion whether this private rented sector ombudsman was going to take over from the 2 ombudsman schemes that agents have to sign up to. One is called the PRS, the Property Redress Scheme. One is called the Property Ombudsman. And it looks like they've reverted back to saying, we want to create a new ombudsman for the private rented sector. And that will obviously have knock-on effects for sales agents, managing agents who are signed up to redress. So we have harangued officials on that, and they've said, well, the minister hasn't given us a direction on that yet. But it looks like all landlords, regardless of whether they use an agent or not, will have to sign up to a redress scheme. Ending rental bidding wars. I think that came up from a previous speaker. Again, that's come up from the Labour narrative. I'm not quite sure how they could ever, they're going to do this, going to enforce it. A lot of the agents pretty much I speak to, it's the tenants who come forward with more rents, higher rents, in order to secure the property. So I'm just not sure how practically they're going to implement that. And applying Arab's law to the sector. And I think ultimately, yeah, we're all shocked about the death of the small child in the property that was full of damp and mould. So essentially they want to reduce hazards, and it's going to bring in timescales for those managing the property in order to respond. So that's no bad thing. All I would say on that is Labour wanted that as an amendment in the Renters Reform Bill last year. I spoke to Angela Rayner's office and said, right, let's see your amendment. Can we support you with that? Because part of the drive on Arab's law in the social rented sector legislation is to ensure that all property managers are qualified in the social rented sector. I said we need to extend that to the PRS. I spoke to Angela Rayner's office when she was in the shadow position, and they said, we've not written it. We haven't written the amendment. It's just a press release. I said, okay, great. So, again, there's a lot of noise going on, but hopefully now they are in government. We're going to see some serious proposals going forward. And then these hardship tests as well has been talked about, very much just sort of speculated in the trade press and the national news. There is a similar situation in France. So it's obviously when they get to court, if there's certain scenarios or certain financial situations where the tenant can't leave, these will be able to be put in guidance or used by the court in order to prevent that going forward. Again, Matthew Pennycook tried to put these in during the committee stage in the Renters Reform Bill. They didn't get headway, so the speculation is he's going to try and bring that forward again, but there's nothing certain yet, and we haven't seen the legislation. Just touching on the Renters Reform Bill, I mean, it was a big piece of work that we took a lot of time on, lobbying on for many years before the legislation, and then when we had the legislation, these were some of the things we heard back from letting agents. It was nearly 600, 700 of our members responded. So I suppose only 54% agreed the PRS database will improve standards. 60% were concerned about the negative impact of removing the fixed-term tenancies. And I suppose that's one thing I haven't actually talked about that's not really been talked about much in the Labour world, but that was a real frustration during the Renters Reform Act that they would remove fixed-term tenancies and knock-on impact that would have in the student market. We managed to get them within the legislation to essentially a 6-month fixed term, so 4 months plus 2 before a notice can be served. So we're hoping that the Labour government will continue that narrative. I think fixed terms potentially could go, but we want to retain them as an option, but that is open for debate. 64% say local authorities have insufficient resources, 90% want more mandatory grounds as well. And certainly in the space of fraud, fake ID, I think is it 2 weeks notice on that probably should be 0 and go to a mandatory ground. So there's things like that we'll push hard on in order to try and improve the situation for landlords and agents. And what did our landlords say? Well, I think we've got nearly 2,000 responses on this. Removal of Section 21 was, of course, a big one. Ending the fixed-term tenancies as well. Moving the rent review clause. Only 22% not too sure about the Ombudsman scheme, and 22% on the PRS database as well. So I'll be around at the end, and it'd be great to chat to you guys. What are your concerns on the legislation? So last couple of slides now. Well, what are we doing about it? And I think if they're going to introduce this PRS database, then let's get rid of selective licensing. I thought I'd get a bit more of a cheer. I was a bit serious in the previous slides, wasn't it? Should we try that again? If they introduce a PRS database, let's scrap selective licensing. Exactly. That's what we want to hear. So that is, some of the, I think, pragmatic and practical things that we're pushing with government. There's me looking very serious, giving evidence to the Public Bill Committee on the Renters Reform Bill, I think last year, the year before. So, yeah, I think things like that we are going to push for. More mandatory grounds, as we've alluded to, court capacity and reform. Yes, fine, get rid of Section 21, accelerated possessions, but let's ensure the courts have capacity. And we actually pushed the last government to review that and ensure a clause that courts would be able to cope with the changes. And fixed-term tenancies as an option. I met the housing minister and he harangued me and the chief executive for 30 minutes. Why are you obsessed with fixed-term tenancies? And obviously we went through all the scenarios, not just in the student space, but also agents who tell me, well, a nurse gets a placement for 2 years in a hospital. They want to know that they can rent that property for that time, families, etc., in schools. So fixed-term tenancies is a big option for us that we want to retain. Grant funding to support the minimum energy efficiency changes. We continue to push the government to have a review into all landlord taxes and costs. That's a big one we hear from agents across the country. And of course, the welfare reform, local housing allowance changes. Thankfully, unfroze LHA, but that is only time limited till April next year. So we'll be pushing hard in the next budget for that to stay at the 30th percentile going forward. So that's a lot of detail. But it's not going to happen immediately. I think there was a lot of talk in the election sort of press that Labour were going to do it immediately. Well, the last time I looked, it's not on the parliamentary timetable in the next few weeks. It wasn't a key part of Keir Starmer's speech last week. And obviously, they've hit the ground running with that focus on the planning, housing and infrastructure. So we've had the Grenfell report today. That will have knock-on effects I think in terms of policy thinking around standards, regulation and building safety, which will filter down, think decent homes, Arab's law. The Housing Committee Chair is important, so we've got those new MPs, there's going to be a new makeup of that committee. Clive Betts, who's been a Labour MP in Sheffield, has been chair of that committee for a while. He's likely to be re-elected, but there'll be new members of that committee. They scrutinise the work of the Ministry of Housing. Conference season starts, so they're going to come back, and they're going to go away again. The National Planning Policy Framework consultation ends, and then we've got the budget on the 30th of October. So I don't think we're going to see the Renters Reform Bill, in the next few weeks. They've obviously got 4 or 5 years to implement it. We want that certainty, but we want to get the legislation right. So I think it's a case of saying, keep calm, carry on. Change is coming, but it can be a managed change. And I think with finders keepers, you're all in safe hands. So thank you very much. I'll stick around. It'd be great to chat to you all. If you've got any questions or feedback, there's my details and the team.